The drive up to the cabin took longer than expected. The road was narrow, winding through dense woods that seemed to swallow the daylight. I hadn't been up here in years, but I remembered the place well enough. It belonged to my uncle, a man who rarely used it anymore. He had given me the keys last month when I told him I needed a quiet place to stay for a while. The cabin sat deep in the forest, far from any main roads. No neighbors, no towns close by, just miles of trees in every direction. It was old, built decades ago, but still sturdy. I arrived just before dusk, parking my truck on the uneven gravel driveway. The place looked the same as I remembered. Wooden walls darkened by years of weather, a sagging porch, and a single window in the front that reflected the last light of the day. I grabbed my bags and walked up the steps, my boots creaking against the wood. The door stuck for a second before giving way with a groan. Inside, the air was stale, filled with the scent of old wood and dust. I flicked on the light switch. The bulbs overhead flickered weakly but held. The place was small, just one main room with a kitchenette, a fireplace, and a door leading to the bedroom. A bathroom was tucked into the corner, its door slightly ajar. I dropped my bags near the couch and stretched my back. The drive had been long, and my muscles ached. After checking the cabinets for food, I found some canned goods that had probably been sitting there for years. I had brought my own supplies, so I wasn't worried. I lit the fireplace, the crackling flames warming the cold air. The first night passed quietly. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the old windows. I lay in bed, listening to the distant sounds of the forest, branches creaking, leaves rustling. At some point, I drifted off. The next morning, I stepped outside with a mug of coffee, breathing in the crisp air. The forest stretched out endlessly, a sea of green and brown. It was peaceful, just as I had hoped. I spent the day clearing some of the overgrown paths around the cabin, cutting back branches that had started to take over. The work was tiring, but it felt good to do something physical. That evening, as the sun dipped below the tree-line, I sat on the porch, watching the light fade. The woods grew darker, the trees blending into a single shadowy mass. The silence was deep, almost unnatural. I had spent time in forests before, but this felt different. It was as if the woods were watching, waiting. I shook the thought away and went inside. That night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint, barely audible over the wind. A slow, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled through the dirt. My heart pounded as I lay still, listening. It was coming from outside. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand, clicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness as I stepped out of bed, my feet cold against the wooden floor. I moved to the window and peered outside. Nothing, just trees swaying in the wind. I turned off the flashlight and climbed back into bed, telling myself it was probably a branch scraping against the ground. The next day, I found something strange near the edge of the property. The dirt looked disturbed, as if someone had been dragging something heavy through it. I crouched down, running my fingers over the marks. They weren't from an animal. Too straight, too deliberate. A chill ran through me. I spent the rest of the day trying to push the thought out of my mind, but it lingered. That night, I locked the doors and made sure the rifle my uncle kept in the cabin was loaded and within reach. The noise returned just past midnight. This time, it was closer. I gripped the rifle and sat up, straining to hear. The dragging sound moved past the cabin, slow and deliberate. My pulse hammered in my ears. I waited, barely breathing. After what felt like an eternity, the sound faded into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. The following morning, I checked the area again. More disturbed dirt, this time leading toward the trees. I followed the trail, my boots crunching over dead leaves. It led deeper into the forest, disappearing into the undergrowth. I stood there for a long time, staring into the trees. Something was out here. That evening, I made sure the cabin was secure. I kept the rifle beside me, my ears tuned to every sound outside. Hours passed, the fire in the hearth casting flickering shadows across the walls. Then, just past 2 a.m, I heard it again. This time, it stopped right outside the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. The dragging sound had ceased, replaced by absolute silence. I gripped the rifle tighter, my palms slick with sweat. I waited, heart pounding. Then slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch. I raised the rifle, aiming toward the door. The steps stopped just outside. The cabin was silent, the only sound my own ragged breathing. Then the doorknob rattled. I didn't think. I fired. The gunshot echoed through the night, deafening in the small space. I heard something stumble back, then the sound of footsteps retreating into the woods. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the rifle with white-knuckled hands. When the first light crept through the trees, I finally stepped outside. There were footprints on the porch. Not boots, not shoes, bare feet caked in mud. I packed my things and left that morning. I didn't look back. I never told my uncle what happened. I just handed him the keys and told him I wouldn't be using the cabin again. I don't know what was out there, but I know one thing for certain: whatever it wasn't just passing through. It was looking for something, and I think it found me. I had been planning the trip for weeks. The idea was simple: escape the noise of the city, shut off my phone, and spend a week in a remote cabin in the mountains. I found a rental listing for a place deep in the woods, miles from any town. The owner warned me about the rough roads and lack of cell service, but that was exactly what I wanted. No people, no distractions, just me and the quiet. The drive up took longer than expected. The paved road turned to dirt, then to something that barely qualified as a road at all. Tall trees pressed in on both sides, their branches forming a tunnel over my car. It had rained the night before, and the mud made the drive even worse. My tires skidded more than once, and I had to keep a tight grip on the wheel. When I finally arrived, I let out a long breath. The cabin was small but sturdy looking, nestled between the trees with a small clearing around it. A wooden porch wrapped around the front, and a stack of firewood sat against the side. I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs. The air smelled like damp earth and pine. It was dead silent. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, nothing. Just the occasional rustling of leaves when the wind picked up. I grabbed my bags and headed inside. The inside was simple, just a single room with a bed, a small kitchen area, and a wood stove. A door in the back led to a tiny bathroom. There was no electricity, just a few lanterns and a wood-burning stove for heat. I set my bags down and took a deep breath. This was exactly what I needed. No emails, no texts, just me and the woods. I spent the first day settling in. I stacked firewood, fetched water from a nearby stream, and made a simple meal. As the sun set, the forest turned darker than I expected. Without city lights, night fell fast. I lit a lantern and sat on the porch, listening to the sounds of the woods. There wasn't much at first, just the occasional chirp of a bird or rustle of leaves. But as the hours passed, I started to hear other things. At first, it was just twigs snapping in the distance. Probably an animal, I told myself. Then came a soft rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. I told myself it was the wind, but the sounds didn't stop. Every few minutes, I heard something new. A slow crunch of leaves, a distant thump, something shifting in the darkness. I held my breath, listening. It was impossible to tell how far away it was. The trees distorted sound, making it impossible to judge distance. I stood up, staring into the blackness between the trees. There was nothing to see, just shadows. After a while, I forced myself to go inside. I locked the door behind me, feeling a little foolish. It was just the woods. Animals moved at night, that was normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just out of sight, watching. I pushed a chair against the door, more for my own peace of mind than anything, then climbed into bed. The silence stretched on, interrupted only by the occasional sound from outside. I lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. There were footprints in the mud near my car. They weren't mine. The prints were faint, almost washed away by the damp ground, but they were there. Not animal tracks, shoe prints. Someone had been near my cabin during the night. My stomach tightened. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing, just the endless stretch of trees. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a hiker had wandered through. Maybe I just hadn't noticed the prints when I arrived. I shook the thought off and went about my day. I tried to stay busy. I chopped some wood, took a short hike, and did my best to enjoy the quiet. But something felt off. The woods didn't feel peaceful anymore. Every now and then, I caught glimpses of movement between the trees, shadows shifting, too quick to be sure if I was really seeing anything at all. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination. But as the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, I locked the door and kept my lantern close. I didn't sit on the porch this time. Instead, I stayed inside, listening. The sounds started again just after sunset. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, then something closer. A soft, deliberate step on the porch. My breath caught in my throat. The door was locked, but my mind raced. Was it an animal? Person? I sat frozen, listening. Another step. The wood creaked under the weight of something just outside the door. I reached for my lantern and held it tight, my pulse pounding. Then silence. Minutes passed. An hour. Nothing. Eventually, I climbed into bed, but I didn't sleep much. Every sound made my skin crawl. I kept the lantern on all night. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I was leaving. I didn't care if I was overreacting. I packed my bags quickly and stepped outside. That's when I saw them, more footprints. They circled the cabin, overlapping, as if someone had been walking around the entire night. I turned toward my car, my heart hammering. Then I stopped. The driver's side door was open. I hadn't left it open. I was sure of that. I stepped closer, my hands shaking. The inside was a mess. My glove compartment open, papers scattered on the seats. Someone had been inside. My keys were still in my pocket, but that didn't make me feel any better. I scanned the tree line, feeling exposed. Was someone watching me right now? I jumped into the car and started the engine. The road was rough, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out onto the road behind me. But there was nothing, just trees, miles and miles of trees. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I found a small diner and parked outside, my hands still shaking. Inside, I sat at the counter, trying to calm down. The waitress poured me a cup of coffee and gave me a curious look. "Rough morning?" she asked. I just nodded. I wasn't sure what to say. What would I even tell her? That I had spent the last 2 nights feeling like I was being hunted by something I never saw? That someone had been outside my cabin all night, walking in circles? That someone had been in my car? I never went back to that cabin. I left a review on the rental site, warning people about the strange footprints and the feeling of being watched. The owner messaged me, saying no one else had ever reported anything like that. Maybe I was the first, or maybe I was just the first to leave. The road leading up to the cabin was rough, covered in potholes and lined with overgrown trees that clawed at the sides of my truck as I drove. It had been nearly an hour since I last saw another vehicle, and the deeper I went into the forest, the more isolated it felt. The late afternoon sun was sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows across the dirt road. It had been years since I'd spent time away from the city, and part of me regretted the decision. I told myself I needed this, a break from the constant pressure, the noise, the people. But now, as I approached the cabin, a deep unease settled in my stomach. I had rented the place online. The listing made it seem cozy, describing it as a rustic escape deep in the woods. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just a simple wooden structure near a quiet lake. It seemed perfect at the time. I needed silence, a place to clear my head. The photos showed a sturdy little cabin with a porch, a stone fireplace, and a small dock stretching out into the water. But as I pulled up in front of it, something felt off. The cabin looked the same as in the pictures, but there was a strange sense of abandonment. The windows were clouded with dust. The wooden steps leading up to the porch were warped and splintered, and the front door looked like it had been left slightly open, just enough to make me uneasy. I parked the truck and stepped out, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air smelled different out here, a mixture of damp earth and pine, but beneath that, there was a musty scent, like rotting wood. I grabbed my bag from the truck and walked up to the cabin. The door wasn't fully open, just barely ajar, enough to make me question if someone had been here before me. I hesitated before pushing it open wider. The hinges creaked loudly in the quiet of the forest. Inside, the cabin was small, just one large room with a bed pushed against the far wall, a wood-burning stove in the corner, and a table with 2 chairs. A door in the back led to what I assumed was a small bathroom. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, except for the floor near the entrance, where faint footprints disturbed the dirt. I didn't like that. I told myself it was nothing, maybe from the last person who stayed here, but the dust on the furniture suggested no one had been inside for a long time. I set my bag down and checked the bathroom. It was small, just a toilet, a sink, and a shower with a curtain that hung limp, yellowed with age. The mirror above the sink was cracked in the corner. I turned on the faucet. The pipes groaned before a weak stream of brownish water spilled out. I let it run for a few minutes until it cleared, then splashed some on my face. The water smelled metallic. Probably the old pipes, I told myself. I went back to the main room and tried the light switch. Nothing. The listing had said the cabin had power, but maybe it was unreliable. I checked the kitchen area, just a small counter with a few cabinets. There was an old gas stove, and when I turned the knob, I heard the faint hiss of gas but couldn't get it to light. I made a mental note to find some matches. There was a lantern on the table, but when I picked it up, it was empty. I should have brought more supplies. Outside, the sun was dipping lower, painting the sky in shades of deep orange and purple. The silence felt heavier now. No birds, no rustling leaves, just stillness. I decided to check out the lake before it got too dark. The dock was in worse shape than I expected. The wood warped and cracked. A few planks were missing, and the ones that remained were soft with rot. I stepped carefully, peering into the water. It was dark, still, and murky, reflecting the trees like a sheet of black glass. Something about it made me uneasy, like if I stared too long, I'd see something staring back. I turned back toward the cabin, and that's when I noticed something. Footprints in the dirt, leading away from the cabin. Not mine. They were older, partially washed out by past rains, but still visible. Someone had been here. The prints led into the woods, disappearing into the thick undergrowth. My first instinct was to go back inside, lock the door, and wait for morning. But part of me wanted to know where they led. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and followed the tracks, stepping carefully over roots and fallen branches. The forest felt different now, denser. The trees pressed closer together, the silence heavier. My footsteps sounded too loud. I walked for maybe 10 minutes before I saw it. A clearing, a small one with something in the center. A hole. A deep, narrow pit dug into the earth, surrounded by disturbed soil. It wasn't a natural hole. It was deliberate. My flashlight beam caught something at the edge of it. Something small, half buried in the dirt. A shoe. A child's shoe. I backed away, my breath coming faster. The air felt colder now. I turned and started back toward the cabin, moving quickly but trying not to run. The trees looked different. I knew I had come straight from the cabin, but now everything seemed unfamiliar. I glanced behind me. The clearing was gone, swallowed by darkness. My flashlight flickered, and for a second, I thought I saw movement between the trees. I didn't stop. I walked faster, forcing myself to stay calm. Finally, I saw the cabin through the trees, its dark shape barely visible against the fading light. When I reached the porch, I stopped and listened. Nothing, just the sound of my own breathing. I stepped inside and locked the door. The cabin felt smaller now, the walls pressing in. I checked the windows. The darkness outside felt thick, like it was watching me. I barely slept that night. Every sound outside made me flinch. The wind against the cabin, the creak of the old wood. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to pale morning light streaming through the window. The forest looked normal again, but I didn't feel normal. I packed my things, loaded up the truck, and left without looking back. As I drove away, I passed the narrow dirt path leading into the woods, where the footprints had disappeared. I almost stopped, almost convinced myself it was just an old memory of something forgotten in the woods. But I kept driving. Some things are better left alone. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A week alone in a remote cabin, away from the noise of the city, away from people, away from everything. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. I needed the break, needed the isolation. Work had been piling up, and I could feel myself burning out. My plan was simple: hike, read, relax, and reset. The drive out there was long, mostly winding roads through dense forest. The kind of roads where you don't see another car for miles. I had rented the cabin online, one of those old wooden places with a stone fireplace and big windows looking out over the trees. The owner had sent me directions and a warning that there was no cell service. That was fine with me. I wanted to disconnect. By the time I arrived, the sun was setting. The cabin was smaller than I expected but looked sturdy. It sat at the end of a narrow dirt path, with trees packed tightly around it. There was a small clearing in front where I parked. I got out, stretched, and breathed in the cold, crisp air. It smelled like pine and damp earth. The only sound was the distant rustling of leaves. It was perfect. I unloaded my supplies: food, water, firewood, a first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries. I had everything I needed. The inside of the cabin was simple but cozy. A main room with a couch and a fireplace, a tiny kitchen, a bathroom, and a bedroom in the back. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just silence. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire, cooked some canned food, and read until I was too tired to keep my eyes open. The bed was old but comfortable enough. I slept deeply. The next morning, I decided to explore. I took my backpack, filled a bottle with water, and set off into the woods. The trails weren't marked, but I wasn't too worried. I had a good sense of direction and my compass. The forest was beautiful. Tall trees, thick undergrowth, the occasional sound of birds or a snapping branch. I walked for hours, stopping now and then to rest. Around midday, I found a small stream. The water was clear, flowing gently over smooth rocks. I crouched down, splashed some on my face, and sat on a fallen log to eat a granola bar. It was peaceful. Then I saw it. Footprints. Not mine. They were fresh, pressed deep into the damp earth, leading away from the stream. I looked around, suddenly aware of how alone I was. The prints were large, maybe a man's, and they didn't belong to me. I hadn't seen another person since I got here. I followed them for a few steps before stopping myself. It was probably just a hiker, I told myself, but something about them bothered me. They weren't coming from anywhere. They just started near the stream and led off into the trees. I decided to head back to the cabin. The hike back felt different, like the trees were closer, the shadows darker. Every now and then, I thought I heard something behind me. A twig snapping, leaves rustling. But when I turned around, there was nothing. Back at the cabin, I locked the door, something I hadn't done the night before. I told myself I was being paranoid. Still, I checked the windows, making sure they were shut tight. That night, the noises started. Soft at first, branches creaking, leaves moving in the wind. But then I heard something else. A sound that didn't belong. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching on the gravel outside. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I listened, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped near the cabin, right outside. I waited, staring at the dark ceiling. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing happened. Eventually, I convinced myself I had imagined it and forced myself to sleep. In the morning, I went outside to check. The ground was damp from the night's cold air. There were footprints, leading around the cabin, stopping by the windows. I didn't go hiking that day. Instead, I stayed close to the cabin, keeping an eye on the tree line. I felt watched. The whole day, I felt watched. The sun started to set, and I locked myself inside early. The The fire burned low as I sat on the couch, gripping the flashlight, waiting. The footsteps came again that night, closer. This time I heard breathing, a slow, heavy sound outside the window. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Then the doorknob rattled. Once, twice. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight so tight my fingers ached. The door was locked. I knew it was locked, but I had never felt so vulnerable in my life. The rattling stopped. The footsteps moved away, but I didn't sleep. At first light, I made my decision. I was leaving. I packed up, loaded everything into the car, and didn't bother cleaning up. I just wanted to go. The engine roared to life and I pulled out fast, tires kicking up dirt. As I turned onto the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. A man stood in the tree line, just at the edge of the clearing, tall, wearing dark clothes. Watching me, I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove until I was miles away, until I saw other cars, other people. Only then did I pull over, hands shaking, breath coming in gasps. I never went back, never contacted the owner, never told anyone what happened. I don't know who he was, what he wanted, or how long he had been watching me. But I know this, I was not alone in those woods, and I never will be again. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A remote cabin deep in the woods, away from the noise of the city, away from people, just me and the quiet of nature. I packed everything I thought I would need: food, water, extra clothes, a flashlight, a small first aid kit, and a hunting knife, just in case. The cabin belonged to a friend of a friend, and he had told me it was in decent condition but warned me that it was deep in the woods, completely off-grid. No phone signal, no electricity, nothing but the cabin and the wilderness. The drive was long, taking me through winding mountain roads, the trees getting denser the further I went. The last stretch of the journey was a dirt path barely wide enough for my car. It was rough, full of potholes and tree roots that made the ride bumpy. After what felt like forever, I finally saw the cabin. It was small, made of old wood that had turned gray from years of exposure. There was a porch with a single rocking chair and a small window to the side, partially covered with an old curtain. The forest around it was thick, pressing in from all sides. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows between the trees. I got out of the car and stretched, taking a deep breath. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. It was eerily quiet. No sound of cars, no distant hum of power lines, just the occasional rustling of leaves and the chirping of birds. I grabbed my bag and walked up the porch, testing the wooden planks beneath my feet. They creaked but held firm. The door was unlocked, just as I had been told it would be. I pushed it open, and a musty smell greeted me. The inside was simple: a single room with a wooden bed, a small table, and an old cast-iron stove. There was a fireplace on one wall, filled with ash and bits of burnt wood. Dust floated in the air, catching the light from the open door. I dropped my bag on the bed and checked the place out. The windows were small and dirty, but intact. The walls had scratches, probably from past visitors moving furniture around. There were no signs of mice or insects, which was a relief. I set up a few things, placed my flashlight and knife on the table, put my food in a small cupboard, and laid out my sleeping bag on the bed. As the sun dipped below the trees, the cabin grew darker. I lit a few candles I had brought with me and settled into the chair by the fireplace. The silence was both calming and unnerving. I wasn't used to this kind of quiet. No distant city sounds, no hum of electronics, just the occasional crack of wood shifting or the wind whispering through the trees. At some point, I dozed off. I wasn't sure how long I had been asleep, but I woke up with a start. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Something had woken me, but I didn't know what. I listened, holding my breath. The wind had picked up, making the trees outside groan and sway. Then, I heard it, a faint rustling, different from the wind. It was close, too close. I sat up slowly, my heart beginning to pound. The sound came again, a soft crunching of leaves just outside the cabin. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. The candles flickered as the wind slipped through the cracks in the walls. I forced myself to stay still, to listen. Then, a thud. Something against the side of the cabin. Not loud, but enough to make my breath catch. I turned toward the window, but it was too dark to see anything outside. I cursed myself for not bringing a lantern. The flashlight was on the table, but turning it on might give away my position. I decided to wait, gripping the knife tighter. Minutes passed, stretching endlessly. The noises stopped. The only thing I could hear was my own breathing. I forced myself to relax, telling myself it was probably just an animal. A raccoon, maybe. A deer brushing against the cabin. I lay back down, still holding the knife, and tried to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside, my muscles stiff from sleeping in fear. The ground was covered in a thin layer of fallen leaves and twigs. I walked around the cabin, searching for any signs of what might have been outside. That's when I saw them, footprints. Human footprints. They circled the cabin, stopping at the windows, at the door. My stomach clenched. Someone had been out here watching me. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. The footprints were fresh. Whoever it was had been here last night, standing outside while I slept. I went back inside and locked the door, as if that would do any good. My mind raced. Should I leave? But my car was parked a short distance away, and I had to hike to it. If someone was out there, they could be waiting. I grabbed my knife again and forced myself to stay calm. Maybe it was a lost hiker. Maybe someone just curious about the cabin. I spent the day on edge, checking the windows every few minutes, listening for any sound. When night came, I built a fire in the fireplace and stayed awake as long as I could. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. The rustling, the soft crunch of leaves. This time it was slower, deliberate. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't move, barely even breathed. The noise stopped right outside the door. Then the doorknob turned. It was slow, testing. My blood ran cold. I gripped my knife, ready. The knob turned again, harder this time, but the lock held. A long silence followed. Then, footsteps, slow, circling the cabin, pausing at each window. I didn't move. I sat there, staring at the door, my breath shallow. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The footsteps faded into the forest. I didn't sleep that night. At first light, I grabbed my things, threw them into my bag, and left. I didn't run. I forced myself to walk, listening for any sound. When I reached my car, I checked the trees one last time before getting in and locking the doors. I started the engine and drove away without looking back. I never found out who it was. I never told anyone what happened. But I know one thing for sure, whoever it was, they weren't lost. They weren't just passing by. They knew I was there, and they were waiting. I always liked traveling alone. Maybe it was because I wanted to stay away from crowds, or maybe I wanted to see places where few people go. This time, I decided to spend some time in a cabin located in a remote mountainous area. It was an old wooden cabin standing in a secluded spot. To reach the cabin, I had to leave my car behind and hike for quite a distance. Trees surrounded me on all sides. In front of me stood an old, weathered wooden cabin with moss growing on its roof, and its door looked worn out. I pushed the door open, and it creaked loudly as it swung inward. Everything inside was old, as if no one had stepped in for years. The floor was covered in dust, and the air smelled damp. I took a look around. In one corner was a wooden bed, its mattress rotting away. There was an old stove covered in grime and a scratched-up wooden table. The windows had tattered curtains hanging from them, swaying slightly in the breeze. Darkness settles quickly in the forest, and as evening approached, I made sure to lock the cabin door securely. A gentle wind was blowing outside, making the leaves rustle. It was an eerie silence, the kind you never experience in the city. I sat on an old chair, thinking about having something to eat, but there wasn't much here. I unpacked my bag, ate some biscuits, and drank some water. I had a knife with me, something I always carried when traveling alone. At night, I started hearing strange noises. At first, I thought it was just the wind hitting the wooden walls, but then I realized it was something else. It sounded like footsteps outside. I thought it might be an animal, but an unsettling feeling crept over me. I picked up my flashlight and peered out the window. It was pitch dark outside, and I couldn't see anything, but I had the distinct feeling that someone was out there, standing close to the cabin. My heart started pounding. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination. I decided to lie down, but sleep was out of the question. After a while, I heard breathing sounds outside, as if someone was standing right by the door. I gripped my knife tightly and held my breath, listening carefully. Then, suddenly, there was a loud sound. It was the door handle being twisted, as if someone was trying to open it. My heart raced. I turned off my flashlight, hiding in the darkness. I kept staring at the door, waiting. After a few moments, the handle was released, and everything went silent again. I knew now that I was not alone. Someone was outside. But who? A lost traveler or someone who had come here on purpose? My mind was racing with possibilities. I decided that I would not open the door until morning. As the night dragged on, I kept hearing occasional footsteps outside, sometimes faint, sometimes close, but no one entered. As soon as daylight broke, I slowly unlocked the door. There was no one there, but in the dirt outside, I saw footprints. They circled around the cabin and then led off into the forest. Without wasting any time, I packed my belongings and decided to leave immediately. I didn't know who had been outside, but I knew they might return. As I walked away, my heartbeat gradually slowed. I turned back one last time to look at the cabin before quickening my pace. I knew one thing for certain: I would never come back here again. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A few days alone in a remote cabin, deep in the woods, away from everything. No phone calls, no emails, no people. Just me, the sound of the wind through the trees, and the quiet peace that only solitude can bring. It had been a stressful year, and I needed the break more than ever. The cabin was old but sturdy, built decades ago by a man who must have wanted to disappear from society. It sat at the end of a long, unmarked dirt road, miles from the nearest town. The nearest neighbor was a good 15 miles away, and there was no cell service. That was exactly what I wanted. I brought enough supplies to last me the whole week: food, water, firewood, and a few books. I had a flashlight, extra batteries, and a hunting knife just in case. The plan was simple: relax, read, maybe take a few hikes during the day, and just enjoy the silence. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked, started a small fire in the wood stove, and cooked a simple meal. The cabin was cozy, with a small kitchen, a single bedroom, and a front porch that overlooked a narrow path leading deeper into the woods. I sat outside as the sun set, listening to the distant sounds of the forest. Birds called to each other, branches rustled in the wind, and somewhere far away, I heard the faint howls of coyotes. It felt peaceful, exactly what I had been hoping for. That night, I slept deeply, the kind of sleep that only comes when you're truly away from the chaos of everyday life. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned down to embers, and the room was nearly pitch black. I listened, straining my ears for any unusual sounds. At first, all I heard was the wind outside, but then, faintly, something else. A soft crunching sound, like footsteps in the leaves. I held my breath, waiting. The sound stopped. Maybe it had just been an animal. A deer, a raccoon, something harmless. Still, I felt uneasy. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and shined it through the small window. Nothing, just trees and darkness. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I wasn't used to the total silence of the woods. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. The ground was damp from the night's dew, and everything looked undisturbed. No signs of anyone or anything unusual. I shook off the uneasy feeling and made breakfast. The day passed quickly. I took a short hike, following an old logging trail that wound up a hill behind the cabin. The view from the top was incredible. Just endless forest stretching in every direction. No roads, no houses, nothing but wilderness. It was exactly what I had wanted. That night, I made sure the cabin was locked up tight before going to bed. Again, I woke up in the middle of the night. This time, I was sure I had heard something. A distinct, deliberate sound. Footsteps on the porch. My heart pounded as I listened. They were slow, careful steps, as if someone was trying not to make noise. Then they stopped right outside the door. I gripped the knife I had placed next to my bed before going to sleep. My mind raced. Could be an animal, but animals don't usually climb wooden steps. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the steps again, this time moving away. Then silence. I waited for a long time before I finally got up and checked. I didn't dare open the door, but through the small window, I could see nothing but darkness. The next morning, I checked the porch. My stomach dropped when I saw the footprints. Not animal tracks, human footprints, bare feet. The prints were uneven, like whoever had made them had been limping. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I thought about leaving right then and there, but I told myself it was probably just some lost hiker, someone who had wandered too far and gotten turned around. Still, I kept my knife on me for the rest of the day and stayed close to the cabin. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair near the front door, listening. The fire was low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The woods were silent, too silent. Then, just past midnight, the footsteps returned. Slow, shuffling steps, circling the cabin. My grip tightened on the knife. Then the doorknob rattled. I nearly stopped breathing. Someone was trying to get in. I stood up slowly, moving as quietly as I could to the window. My hands were shaking. I raised the flashlight, but before I could turn it on, something moved just outside the glass. A shadowy figure, hunched over, standing completely still. Watching, I turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, but by the time it reached the window, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At the first light of dawn, I packed my bag, grabbed my keys, and left. I didn't even bother eating breakfast. I drove straight to town, not looking back. When I got to the nearest gas station, I told the clerk about what had happened. He listened quietly, then sighed. "You're not the first one," he said. "Couple years back, another guy stayed at that cabin. Same thing. Heard footsteps, saw someone watching him. Never found out who it was." I asked if anyone had ever investigated. He shook his head. "Sheriff looked into it. Never found anything. But people don't stay at that cabin for long. I didn't either. I never went back, and I never will." I had been planning this trip for months, ever since I found the listing online. A remote cabin deep in the woods, miles away from any town or city, promising complete solitude and a break from the constant noise of daily life. The pictures showed a well-built structure, sturdy wooden walls, a stone chimney, and a wraparound porch. It seemed perfect. The drive out took longer than I expected. The last stretch of road wasn't even a road at all, just a dirt path winding through dense trees. My car's tires kicked up loose gravel, and at one point, I thought I'd get stuck. I finally reached the clearing where the cabin stood, the sun already dipping below the horizon. The trees around the cabin were thick, their shadows stretching long and dark across the ground. I grabbed my bags, locked my car, and made my way to the door. The key was in a lockbox on the porch, just as the owner had said. The cabin smelled of old wood and dust. I flicked on the lights. A single bulb in the center of the ceiling hummed to life, casting dim light over the small space. There was a living area with a worn-out couch, a small kitchen with an old gas stove, and a single bedroom with a narrow bed pushed against the wall. I set my bags down and went to check out the back. The forest was close, almost too close. The trees stood like silent walls, enclosing the cabin. The only open space was the narrow clearing where my car sat. That first night, I lay in bed listening to the absolute silence outside. No traffic, no people, no distant hum of civilization. Just the occasional creak of wood as the cabin settled and the faint rustling of wind in the trees. I slept deeply, waking only once when something outside made a faint snapping sound, like a twig breaking underfoot. I told myself it was an animal and went back to sleep. The next morning, I went for a walk. I followed a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest, moving carefully over roots and loose rocks. The deeper I went, the more I felt an odd sense of unease. The trees were thick here, their branches tangled high above, blocking out most of the sky. The air was still. I turned back, deciding not to go any further. That night, I heard the sound again. A crack outside, then another. Something was moving. I sat up in bed, listening. The sound was close, right outside the cabin. I held my breath, my ears straining. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer. But then I heard something that made my stomach drop. A faint, deliberate scraping sound against the cabin wall. I stayed in bed, barely breathing, waiting for whatever was outside to leave. After what felt like an eternity, the sound stopped. The next morning, I went outside to check. There were no tracks, no signs that anything had been there. I told myself I had imagined it, that my mind was playing tricks on me. The third night was worse. I woke up to a noise directly on the porch. The sound of something shifting, moving. Then the doorknob rattled. My heart pounded in my chest. I sat frozen in bed, waiting. The rattling stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. I got up slowly, moving as quietly as I could. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window. I shone the light outside, sweeping it across the porch. Nothing. But then I saw it. A single boot print in the dirt just beyond the steps. Too big to be an animal, too clear to be old. Someone had been there. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed my bags. I had planned to stay a full week, but I couldn't do it anymore. Something wasn't right. I loaded my things into the car, locking the cabin behind me. As I pulled onto the dirt path, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. Standing just at the tree line, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I just kept driving until I reached the main road. I never found out who or what had been outside my cabin those nights, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never go back. I remember the cold, crisp air biting at my skin as I stepped out of my truck. The drive had been long, hours winding through desolate roads, the kind where you rarely see another vehicle. My back ached from sitting too long, and my legs felt stiff as I stretched them out. The gravel crunched under my boots as I took in my surroundings. The cabin stood in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick, towering trees that swayed gently with the wind. It was an old structure, the wood darkened from years of exposure, the roof sagging slightly in places. I had rented it for a week, hoping for some time away from everything. No distractions, no people, just me, the woods, and silence. I grabbed my bags from the truck bed and made my way up the creaky steps. The key was exactly where the owner said it would be, tucked beneath a loose board on the porch. The door groaned as I pushed it open, revealing the dim interior. Dust floated in the sunlight that streamed through the windows. The air smelled stale, like old wood and something faintly damp. It was a simple space, one main room with a kitchen area in the corner, a small bathroom, and a bedroom with a rickety bed pushed up against the far wall. The floorboards beneath me felt uneven, shifting slightly under my weight. I set my bags down and moved through the cabin, familiarizing myself with the place. The windows were old, the glass warped in places, and the curtains looked like they hadn't been washed in years. The furniture was minimal. A table with 2 chairs, a worn-out couch, a fireplace with a pile of wood stacked beside it. Everything about the place felt old, forgotten. After unpacking, I stepped outside to get a better feel of my surroundings. The forest was dense, the trees packed tightly together. There was a small clearing around the cabin, but beyond that, the woods stretched endlessly. It was the kind of place where you could get lost easily, where everything looked the same no matter which direction you turned. I could hear the distant rush of a river somewhere, hidden within the trees. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the ground. I stood there for a while, listening to the quiet, feeling the weight of solitude settle over me. It was peaceful, but there was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, an unease that I tried to shake off. That first night, I lit a fire in the fireplace and sat on the couch, listening to the logs crackle as the flames ate away at them. The warmth was comforting against the chill that seeped through the old walls. I flipped through a book I had brought with me, but my mind kept drifting. The wind outside picked up, howling through the trees, rattling against the windows. Every so often, I thought I heard something else, something beneath the wind, subtle sounds, like footsteps crunching through the leaves. I told myself it was just my imagination, the isolation playing tricks on me. Sleep didn't come easy that night. The bed was uncomfortable, the mattress lumpy and stiff. I lay there in the dark, listening. The cabin settled with the occasional creak. The wind continued its relentless assault, and somewhere out there, I swore I heard something moving. A rustling, faint but deliberate. My mind raced through possibilities. Animals, shifting trees, maybe just my own paranoia. I told myself it was nothing, forced my eyes shut, and eventually drifted into a restless sleep. Morning came with an eerie stillness. The wind had died down, and the forest was unnervingly quiet. I stepped outside, the air crisp and cold. The ground was damp, the scent of wet earth strong. As I walked around the cabin, stretching out my stiff muscles, I noticed something strange. Footprints. They weren't mine. The pattern was different, the size slightly smaller. They led from the edge of the trees to the cabin's porch, stopping right at the door before turning back into the woods. My stomach twisted at the sight. There was no reason for anyone else to be out here. The nearest town was miles away, and as far as I knew, I was the only one renting a cabin in this area. I felt a sudden chill, one that had nothing to do with the morning air. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it could have been an animal. But the prints were too precise, too human. I spent the rest of the day keeping busy, chopping some wood, hiking a short distance into the woods, but that feeling of unease never left. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing at the tree line, watching. That night, I locked the doors and windows, something I hadn't bothered doing the night before. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees. The fire in the fireplace crackled, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I sat on the couch, staring into the flames, trying to push away the lingering sense of unease. Then I heard it, a noise outside, a distinct sound, like footsteps crunching on gravel. My breath caught in my throat. I turned my head slowly toward the window, but the glass was too dark to see anything clearly. My heart pounded in my chest. I sat there, frozen, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped. Silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. I didn't move, barely even breathed. Minutes passed. Then, suddenly, a loud bang against the door. My whole body tensed. I stared at the door, heart hammering. Another bang, harder this time. Someone was out there. My mind raced through my options. There was no phone signal out here, no way to call for help. I reached for the fire poker beside the fireplace, gripping it tightly. The banging stopped. Silence again. I waited, every muscle in my body coiled with tension. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to stand, moving slowly toward the window. I pressed my face close to the glass, trying to see into the darkness. Nothing, just the trees, the wind, the night. I barely slept that night. Every sound made me jolt awake. By the time morning came, I had already decided I was leaving. I packed my things quickly, tossing them into the truck, my mind screaming at me to get out of there. But as I turned the key in the ignition, the truck sputtered and died. I tried again. Nothing. My stomach twisted. I popped the hood, checking everything I knew how to, but it was useless. The engine wasn't turning over. I was stuck. I spent the next few hours trying to figure out what to do. There was a road, but the nearest town was too far to walk before nightfall. I debated staying one more night and leaving at first light, hoping I could flag someone down on the road. As the sun started setting, I locked myself inside the cabin, heart pounding at every noise outside. I didn't light the fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I sat in the dark, gripping the fire poker, listening. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. The footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. Then, a soft scratching at the door. My breath came in shallow gasps. I didn't move. I didn't dare. The scratching continued for what felt like hours before finally stopping. Silence followed, and I stayed frozen in place, waiting. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off. When I woke, sunlight was streaming through the windows. I bolted upright, heart still pounding. I grabbed my bags and stepped outside, glancing around. The footprints were back, circling the cabin this time. My chest tightened. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed whatever I could carry and started walking, sticking to the road, moving as fast as I could. Took hours before I finally reached the town. I didn't look back. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I just got in my car, left the rental behind, and never went back. To this day, I still don't know who or what was out there. But I do know one thing. I was not alone in those woods. I don't know why I agreed to spend the weekend alone in that cabin. Maybe it was the way my friend Mike had talked it up, saying it was the perfect place to get away from everything. No service, no people, just the quiet of the woods. Maybe it was because I just needed a break from the city, from work, from life in general. Whatever the reason, I had packed up my truck on Friday afternoon and made the drive out into the mountains, following the long, winding dirt road until I reached the small clearing where the cabin stood. It was smaller than I had imagined, a one-room structure with a lofted bed above a tiny kitchenette. The wood was old, the kind that had darkened with time and weather. There was a front porch with a single wooden chair and a fire pit a few yards away, surrounded by stumps for sitting. The forest pressed in from all sides, thick and unyielding, the trees tall and close together. It was quiet, except for the occasional sound of birds and the rustling of leaves in the wind. It felt isolated in a way that was both peaceful and unsettling. I unlocked the door with the key Mike had given me and stepped inside. It smelled of aged wood and dust, with the faintest hint of smoke from past fires. There was a small stove, a sink with a hand pump, and a narrow cot against the far wall. A single window looked out into the woods, and a ladder led up to the loft where the main bed was. There was no electricity, just a few oil lamps and a pile of firewood stacked against the wall. After unloading my things, I decided to take a walk before it got dark. The woods were dense but not impossible to navigate, and I found a narrow trail leading away from the cabin. The air was cool, and the deeper I went, the quieter it became. I walked for about half an hour before turning back, noting how easy it would be to lose my way if I weren't careful. By the time I returned, the sun was low, and I decided to start a fire. The flames crackled, sending sparks into the air as I sat on one of the stumps and watched the night settle in. The silence was heavy, broken only by the occasional chirp of a cricket or the rustle of something moving in the underbrush. I tried to ignore the feeling of being watched, telling myself it was just my imagination. Still, I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. I ate a simple meal, then went inside, locking the door behind me. The oil lamp cast flickering shadows on the walls as I climbed the ladder to the loft. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and despite my unease, I eventually drifted off to sleep. I woke up to a noise outside. It was faint but distinct, the sound of footsteps on dried leaves. My heart pounded as I listened, barely breathing. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, moving past the cabin. I told myself it was an animal, but the steps were too heavy, too measured. I reached for my phone before remembering there was no service. My truck was parked out front, but I wasn't about to go outside. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sounds to return. But after a long while, there was only silence. The next morning, I found nothing unusual around the cabin. No tracks, no signs that anyone had been there. Still, the feeling of being watched hadn't left me. I decided to stay close to the cabin for the day, chopping wood and keeping the fire going. The hours passed slowly, and by the time the sun started to set, I felt exhausted but uneasy. That night, the sounds came again. This time, they were closer. A slow shuffling near the porch, then what sounded like something brushing against the wall. I stayed in the loft, barely daring to breathe. The noises continued for what felt like hours before fading into the distance. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. The dirt near the porch had been disturbed, as if someone had been standing there for a long time. There were no clear footprints, but the grass was pressed down in strange patterns. I considered packing up and leaving, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it had been an animal after all. Maybe the isolation was just getting to me. The third night was worse. I was woken by the sound of something tapping against the window. The window was small, barely large enough for a person to fit through, but the thought of someone standing there in the dark made my blood run cold. I stayed frozen, waiting. The tapping stopped, and then, for the first time, I heard breathing. Deep, slow, right outside the glass. I gripped the knife I had brought with me, my hands shaking. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. Eventually, the breathing faded. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my things, threw them into the truck, and started the engine. The road back felt longer than before, the trees pressing in on all sides. Every now and then, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the woods, watching me leave. I never told Mike what happened. I just handed him back the key and made an excuse about being too busy to go back. He shrugged it off, probably assuming I just wasn't cut out for the solitude. I didn't correct him, but sometimes, late at night, I find myself thinking about that cabin, about the sounds in the dark, and I wonder if whoever or whatever was out there that weekend is still waiting for someone else to come along. I needed a break from the city, from the noise, the constant movement, the pressure of work that never seemed to end. So, I rented a small cabin deep in the woods for a week. The pictures online showed a simple place, wooden walls, a small porch surrounded by nothing but trees. It was exactly what I needed. A quiet place where I could disconnect, read, maybe do some hiking, and just be alone with my thoughts. The drive took longer than expected. The last few miles were on a dirt road, barely wide enough for my car, with trees pressing in from both sides. My GPS had lost signal a while back, but I had printed directions just in case. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was already low, casting long shadows across the clearing. The place looked older than it did in the pictures, the wood darkened by years of exposure. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped up to the door. The key was in the lockbox, just as the owner had promised. I turned it and stepped inside. It was small but functional. A single main room with a bed in the corner, a couch, a wood stove, and a tiny kitchen area. The bathroom was a separate little room off to the side. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, just a stack of old books and a radio that barely picked up any stations. That was fine. I wasn't here for entertainment. I dropped my bag, took a deep breath, and let the silence settle around me. It was peaceful in a way that felt almost unnatural at first. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, just the wind in the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. That first night, I built a fire in the stove, made a simple meal, and sat on the porch with a book. The air was crisp, the sky full of stars. It felt good to be away from everything. I don't know what woke me in the middle of the night. A sound, maybe, or just the unfamiliar quiet. I lay there, listening, but all I could hear was the wind outside. The cabin was cold. The fire had burned low, so I got up to throw another log in. As I stood by the stove, I glanced at the window and froze. Something had moved out there. It was just a shadow, a flicker of movement against the trees. I stared, waiting for it to happen again, but there was nothing. Probably an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easy after that. The next day, I explored the area. There was a small path leading away from the cabin, winding deeper into the forest. I followed it for a while, enjoying the quiet. The trees here were thick, the ground covered in fallen leaves. I didn't see any signs of other people, no old campsites or trails, just untouched wilderness. Felt remote, isolated. That evening, as the sun was setting, I heard something. It was faint at first, just a soft rustling in the trees. Then a snap like a branch breaking underfoot. I turned quickly, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. That night, I locked the door. I didn't sleep well. Every little sound made me tense up. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. But when I finally worked up the courage to peek out the window, there was nothing but darkness. The third day, I decided to check the area around the cabin more closely. I found something that made my stomach tighten. Footprints. They weren't mine. I had only worn hiking boots, and these were different. Barefoot. Human. The prints were fresh, leading from the tree line to the cabin, circling around it, then back into the woods. I felt a cold knot of fear settle in my stomach. Someone had been here last night, watching. I packed my things. The plan had been to stay a week, but I wasn't about to spend another night here. The problem was my car wouldn't start. It had been fine when I arrived, but now the engine wouldn't turn over. No signal on my phone, no way to call for help. I was stuck. I spent the rest of the day inside trying to stay calm. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just some local wandering through. But why circle the cabin like that? Why come so close? As night fell, I locked the door and made sure the stove was burning hot. I sat up for hours listening. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Close. Slow. I held my breath, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Then the handle moved. Someone was trying to get in. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a fire poker, and stood by the door. The handle jiggled again, harder this time. Then silence. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I sat down, still gripping the poker. The fire burned low. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, the sun was coming up. I opened the door slowly, heart hammering. The footprints were there again, leading away into the woods. This time, there was something else. A knife, stuck into the porch railing. A long, rusted blade, the handle wrapped in old cloth. That was it. I wasn't waiting around to find out who left it. I gathered my things, forced myself to stay calm, and tried the car again. This time, it started. I didn't look back as I drove away. Didn't stop until I was miles away, back on paved roads, back in civilization. I never found out who it was. The owner of the cabin said no one lived nearby, just empty woods for miles. Maybe it was some drifter, some local hermit. Or maybe it was someone who had been watching for a long time, waiting for someone like me to come along. All I know is I won't be going back. I had been hiking alone for years, never had a problem. I liked the quiet, the isolation. It gave me time to think, time to be away from the noise of daily life. This trip was no different, or so I thought. I had planned to hike through a remote forest, following an old logging trail that had long since been abandoned. It was supposed to be a 3-day trip. Just me, my backpack, and the woods. But things didn't go as planned. The first day was uneventful. The air was crisp, the sky overcast but dry. I moved steadily, following the trail deeper into the forest. I had studied the maps, knew the general direction I needed to go. There were no marked trails out here, just faint remnants of where the old loggers used to work. The deeper I went, the more the forest closed in around me. Thick trees, dense undergrowth, not much sign of human activity for years. Exactly how I liked it. That night, I set up camp near a small clearing. I built a fire, ate a simple meal, and settled in for the night. The woods were quiet, only the occasional rustling of leaves or distant hoot of an owl. I slept well, better than I usually did in the city. The second day, I pushed further into the woods. The trail was barely visible, but I had a good sense of direction. The terrain got rougher, steeper in some places. I had to navigate around fallen trees and thick patches of brush. Around midday, I stumbled upon something unexpected: a cabin. It wasn't marked on any of the maps I had studied. It looked old, abandoned, the wood darkened with age and weather. The windows were either missing or covered with grime so thick I couldn't see inside. The door was slightly ajar. I wasn't looking for shelter, but curiosity got the better of me. I approached cautiously, pushing the door open a little more. The interior was just as neglected as the outside: dust-covered surfaces, broken furniture, a thick smell of damp wood and decay. It was obvious no one had lived here in years. I poked around briefly, but there wasn't much to see. A rusted stove in the corner, a small wooden table with one leg broken, a bed frame with no mattress. Just another forgotten structure left to rot in the middle of the forest. I left the cabin behind and continued my hike. The day passed without much incident. I found a good spot near a creek to set up camp for the night. The sound of running water was always nice, made the place feel less empty. I built another fire, cooked my meal, and settled in. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. I lay still, listening. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow. The forest was silent, too silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant animal sounds, just nothing. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, somewhere just outside my camp. My heart started pounding. I wasn't easily scared, but out here, miles from civilization, it didn't take much to put someone on edge. I stayed completely still, listening. The footsteps continued, circling my campsite. Not an animal, too heavy, too controlled. Person. But who? There shouldn't have been anyone else out here. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. The footsteps stopped. I strained my ears, but there was only silence again. I stayed awake for hours, every nerve on edge, but nothing else happened. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. Morning came, and I stepped out of my tent, scanning the area. No signs of anything. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to indicate someone had been there. But I knew what I heard. It wasn't my imagination. I considered cutting my trip short, but decided against it. I had come out here for solitude, and I wasn't going to let paranoia ruin it. I packed up and moved on, heading further into the woods. By midday, the forest began to change. The trees grew thicker, the undergrowth more tangled. It felt different, like I was being watched. I ignored the feeling and kept moving. Then I found the second cabin. It was nearly identical to the first. Same aged wood, same broken windows, same eerie sense of abandonment. But this one had something different. The door was wide open, and inside, I could see footprints in the dust. Fresh ones. I stood there, heart hammering in my chest. Someone had been here recently. Maybe they were still here. I didn't go inside. Instead, I backed away, keeping my eyes on the doorway. I didn't see anyone, but that didn't mean they weren't watching me. I turned and walked away, forcing myself not to run. Running in the woods was a bad idea. Too easy to trip, too easy to get lost. But my instincts screamed at me to move faster. I kept going, pushing forward, hoping to put as much distance between me and that cabin as possible. The sun started to set, and I knew I needed to find a place to camp. I found a small clearing and set up quickly, not bothering with a fire. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. As darkness fell, the uneasy feeling grew stronger. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my tent, knife in hand, listening. Hours passed, and then I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time. They stopped right outside my tent. I held my breath. The fabric of my tent shifted slightly, like someone had brushed against it. I gripped my knife so tightly my hand ached. Then silence. No retreating footsteps, no rustling leaves. Just silence. I didn't move. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn crept through the trees. When I finally dared to step outside, there was nothing. No footprints, no signs of anything. But I knew what I had heard. I wasn't alone out there. I packed my gear in record time and started hiking back the way I had come. I didn't stop, didn't rest. I moved as fast as I could without breaking into a run. The whole time, I felt eyes on me, but I never saw anyone. By the time I reached the place where I had camped on the first night, the sun was starting to set. I didn't stop. I kept going, pushing myself past exhaustion. I had never felt fear like that before, pure, instinctual terror. I reached my car just as darkness fully set in. I threw my pack into the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I didn't look back. I just drove, putting as much distance between myself and that forest as possible. I don't know who was out there. Maybe it was some hermit living in those cabins, someone who didn't want visitors. Or maybe it was something worse. I never went back to find out. That was the last solo hike I ever took. I had been looking forward to the trip for months. The idea of spending a full week alone in a remote cabin, away from the noise and routine of daily life, felt like exactly what I needed. Work had been stressful and I was feeling drained. A quiet place in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees and the stillness of nature, seemed like the perfect escape. The cabin was a rental I had found online, advertised as secluded and peaceful, which was exactly what I wanted. The drive took longer than expected. The last stretch was a winding dirt road that led deeper and deeper into the forest. My car bounced over rocks and potholes, and I had to slow down to a crawl in some areas. It had rained the night before, and parts of the road were muddy, making the tires slip a little. I kept going, watching the trees close in around me. There was no cell service anymore, and the GPS had stopped working miles back. I was relying on the printed directions I had brought with me. Eventually, I saw the cabin through the trees. It was small and simple, made of dark wood with a steep roof. There was a small porch in the front and a single window on the upper level. The area around it was clear of trees for about 30 feet, giving it a lonely appearance in the middle of the dense forest. I pulled the car up close and turned off the engine. The sudden silence was almost unnerving. I could hear nothing but the faint rustle of leaves and the distant sound of running water from a nearby stream. Inside, the cabin was basic but comfortable. A fireplace, a small kitchen, a couch, and a wooden dining table filled the main room. There was a single bedroom upstairs with a narrow wooden staircase leading up to it. The air smelled of old wood and dust. I set my bags down, checked the place out, and made sure everything was as expected. The owner had left a short note on the table, welcoming me and explaining that the water came from a well and the electricity was from solar panels. There was no Wi-Fi, which I had already known. I spent the first evening settling in. I made myself a simple dinner, lit the fireplace, and read for a while. The quiet was overwhelming at first, but I reminded myself that this was what I had wanted. Before going to bed, I stepped outside for some fresh air. The night was dark, with no nearby lights, and the sky was full of stars. The trees stood tall and silent, stretching endlessly in every direction. It was a little eerie, but I brushed it off and went back inside. I locked the door and headed up to bed. The first night, I woke up at some point in the early hours, feeling uneasy. The room was pitch dark, and the silence was absolute. I listened, wondering what had woken me. Then I heard it, a faint sound outside. It was soft, almost like footsteps, but too light to be human. Probably an animal, I told myself. Maybe a deer passing through. I stayed still for a while, listening. The sound stopped. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I went outside and looked around. The ground was damp from the previous rain, and I noticed a few marks in the dirt. They were footprints, barefoot, human. They led from the edge of the trees to the side of the cabin and then back again. I stood there for a long moment, staring at them. My first thought was that someone had wandered through by accident, maybe a hiker lost in the woods. But there were no trails nearby, and the footprints were the only ones visible. No signs of shoes, no path leading from or to a road. Just bare footprints in the dirt. I shook off the unease creeping over me. Maybe the previous guest had walked around barefoot, and the prints had been preserved in the damp earth. It was possible. I convinced myself of that and went about my day. I spent most of the afternoon exploring. There was a stream about a 5-minute walk from the cabin, its water running clear over smooth stones. I filled a bottle, splashed some on my face, and sat on a fallen tree for a while, enjoying the quiet. The forest felt different in the daytime, peaceful, almost comforting. But as the sun started to dip, the feeling shifted. The trees seemed to close in, and the air grew colder. I headed back before darkness fell. That night, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't a sound that woke me. It was a feeling, a deep, unsettling sense that something was wrong. I stayed still, my ears straining in the silence. Then, from outside, I heard it again. The same soft footsteps, but they weren't moving randomly. They were slow, deliberate. They circled the cabin. I sat up, heart pounding. The sound stopped directly below my bedroom window. I couldn't see anything in the darkness outside. I didn't move, barely breathing. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, the footsteps moved away, back into the woods. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When morning came, I checked outside again. More footprints. The same barefoot tracks, but this time they were fresh. They circled the cabin. I stared at them, my mind racing. This wasn't just some lost hiker. Someone was watching me. Someone had been here, walking around my cabin while I slept. I considered leaving. The idea of driving that rough road in the dark had kept me from making the decision the night before. But now, in daylight, it felt like the smarter option. I packed my things quickly and loaded them into the car. But when I turned the key in the ignition, nothing happened. The car was dead. Panic started creeping in. I checked the battery, the fuel. Everything seemed fine. I tried again. Nothing. It was as if the car had simply shut down. I was stuck. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. I spent the day trying to come up with a plan. There was no cell service, no way to call for help. The nearest town was over an hour away by car. On foot, it would take a full day at least, and I didn't know the roads well. My best option was to wait until morning and try again. Maybe the car would work after some time. Maybe I'd find another way. As the sun set, the fear set in. I locked all the doors and windows, made sure the fire was going, and sat with my back against the wall, listening. Hours passed. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard them again. The footsteps, slow, careful, moving around the cabin. Then, a sound I will never forget. The doorknob rattled. Whoever was out there was trying to get in. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I gripped the fireplace poker, heart hammering. The rattling stopped, and silence filled the room. Then the footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep. I sat there, listening until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. When I finally gathered the courage to check outside, the footprints were there again. But this time there were more. 2 sets. One leading to the door, another leading away. I tried the car again. This time it started. I didn't think. I just drove. I didn't stop until I reached the main road. I didn't look back. A week later, I got a call from the cabin owner. He wanted to check if everything had been okay with my stay. I asked him if anyone else had rented the place after me. He said no. No one had been there since I left. I didn't tell him what happened. I just told him I wouldn't be coming back. I had been planning this trip for months. A solo getaway deep in the mountains where I could escape the noise of daily life. I wanted quiet, complete isolation. I found a small, off-grid cabin online, about a 4-hour drive from the nearest town. The listing mentioned no electricity, no cell service, and a long dirt road leading up to it. That sounded perfect. I packed my truck with everything I'd need. Food, water, a few books, my sleeping bag, and some firewood. The drive was peaceful at first. The paved highway turned into a rough, winding dirt road, and I could feel the remoteness growing with every mile. Trees crowded closer, their bare branches stretching over the path like skeletal fingers. The further I went, the worse the road became. Deep ruts from past rainstorms made the drive slow and bumpy. My tires crunched over loose gravel, and I felt the truck slipping slightly at some points. It took nearly an hour to reach the cabin after turning off the main road. By the time I arrived, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin was smaller than I expected, just a one-room structure with a tiny porch and a rusty metal roof. The wood was old, gray, and weathered, but it looked sturdy. There was an old fire pit out front, surrounded by a few logs for sitting. Behind the cabin, the forest stretched endlessly, dark and silent. I stepped out of the truck, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I grabbed my bag and went inside. The cabin was simple: a small cot against one wall, a wooden table, a chair, and a wood-burning stove. Dust covered the surfaces, and a faint, musty smell lingered in the air. It looked like no one had been here in a long time. I set my bag down and began unpacking, trying to settle in before it got too dark. The first night was uneventful. I built a fire outside, cooked a can of beans, and sat listening to the sounds of the forest. Owls hooted in the distance, and occasionally, I heard rustling in the underbrush, probably just a deer or a raccoon. It was peaceful, exactly what I had wanted. The second day, I decided to explore. I followed a narrow trail behind the cabin, winding deeper into the woods. The trees were dense, their trunks thick and covered in patches of moss. Fallen leaves crunched under my boots. After about an hour of walking, I came across something strange: an old, abandoned campsite. A torn tent, faded from exposure, lay collapsed on its side. Rusty cans and a broken lantern were scattered around. It looked like it had been there for years. I felt a chill run through me. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints, nothing to suggest recent activity. Just a forgotten campsite left to rot. Something about it made me uneasy. I turned back, making my way to the cabin. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, I heard something outside. At first, it was just the wind, whispering through the trees. But then came another sound, a slow, deliberate crunching of leaves. Not the random rustling of an animal, but something heavier. Human footsteps. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped just outside the cabin. My heart pounded. I reached for the flashlight beside me, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want whoever or whatever was out there to know I was awake. Minutes passed, stretching endlessly. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound was gone. I stayed awake for hours listening, but I never heard it again. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. They weren't mine. They were fresh. Someone had been standing there, just outside my door, in the middle of the night. I scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of movement, but the forest was still. I considered leaving, but a part of me didn't want to run just because of a few footprints. Maybe it was just a hiker who had wandered too close. Maybe it was nothing. I told myself I was overreacting. That night, I locked the cabin door and kept my knife within reach. The fire crackled in the stove, filling the cabin with warmth, but I couldn't relax. Every little sound outside made my skin crawl. Around midnight, I heard it again. Slow, heavy footsteps circling the cabin. This time, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it through the window. Nothing, just darkness and trees. But the sound had stopped the moment I moved, like whoever was out there knew I was listening. I barely slept. The next morning, I made a decision. I was leaving. I packed my things quickly, throwing everything into my truck. As I loaded the last bag, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. More footprints, but this time they weren't just outside the cabin. They were around my truck. Someone had been watching me. I got in and started the engine. Gravel spun beneath my tires as I backed up and turned toward the dirt road. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Standing at the tree line was a figure, too far to see clearly, but close enough to know they were watching me leave. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I drove straight to town, heart pounding the whole way. When I finally reached a gas station with cell service, I called the property owner. He seemed surprised but not concerned. "You're not the first guest to leave early," he said. I didn't ask what that meant. I didn't want to know. I never went back. never liked the idea of being alone in the woods, but life has a way of forcing you into situations you'd rather avoid. After a long and exhausting year, I needed a break from everything. Work, city life, the constant noise, everything had drained me. So, when my old friend told me about a cabin deep in the forest that he sometimes rented out, I figured it was a good opportunity to disconnect for a while. It was far from any town, completely isolated, with no internet, no phone signal. Exactly what I thought I needed. The drive to the cabin was long, and the roads got rougher as I went deeper into the forest. The trees grew taller, denser, and soon, the only sound was the low hum of my car engine and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had started to set, casting an orange glow over the trees. It was a simple wooden structure, small but sturdy looking. There was a small porch in the front with an old rocking chair, and a stack of firewood sat neatly by the door. My friend had left the keys in a small metal box near the door, just as he had promised. Inside, the cabin was basic but comfortable. A small kitchen, a single bedroom, and a living area with a fireplace. There was no electricity, just an old generator that I had to turn on manually. It sputtered to life after a few tries, giving me just enough power for the few dim lights inside. The air smelled of wood and dust, and everything was quiet. I took a deep breath, trying to let the calmness settle in, but something about the silence felt heavy. The first night passed uneventfully. I made a small meal on the gas stove, read a book by lantern light, and eventually fell asleep to the distant sound of owls. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure why. The cabin was silent, the kind of silence that almost rings in your ears. I listened carefully, my heart beating a little faster than I'd like to admit. Then, I heard its soft, deliberate footsteps outside. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The footsteps were slow, careful, circling the cabin. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal? A lost hiker? But something about the way the steps moved told me that whoever or whatever it wasn't wandering. It was deliberate. It was watching. I stayed completely still, barely even breathing, until the sound eventually faded away. Even then, I didn't move for a long time. When I finally worked up the courage to look outside, there was nothing but darkness. The trees stood still, and the forest was quiet again. I told myself it was just paranoia, just the unfamiliar sounds of the woods playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next day, I walked around the cabin, looking for any signs of what might have been outside. I found nothing at first, no footprints, no broken branches, nothing out of place. But then, just a few feet away from the cabin's front door, I noticed something odd. A single, deep footprint in the dirt. A human footprint. But the thing that sent a chill down my spine was that it wasn't leading toward the cabin. It was leading away, as if someone had been standing there, just watching. I tried to shake it off, but an uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. I spent the day chopping firewood and trying to keep myself busy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement between the trees, quick flashes of shadow just at the edge of my vision. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing. That night, I locked the door and made sure the generator was running. The dim light flickered, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. I forced myself to eat, but I had no appetite. My body was tense, my ears tuned in to every tiny noise. Hours passed, and just as I was starting to convince myself that everything was fine, I heard it again. The footsteps. This time they were slower, closer. I held my breath, listening. The sound moved around the cabin, stopping at the door. Then, something even worse. The doorknob rattled. I felt ice flood my veins. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I stayed perfectly still, gripping the armrest of the chair I was sitting in. The rattling stopped, but then came another sound. Fingertips, lightly dragging across the wooden walls of the cabin, circling it, testing it. Whoever was out there wasn't in a hurry. They were playing with me. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, waiting for whatever was outside to leave. Eventually, the sounds stopped, but I didn't move for a long time. I barely slept that night, Morning came, and the first thing I did was check the area again. This time, there were more footprints. They led from the tree line to my door, then back into the woods. And they weren't mine. I wanted to leave. Every instinct in my body told me to pack up and get the hell out of there. But I told myself I was being irrational, that I was overreacting. Maybe some local hunter had wandered too close. Maybe some prankster knew about the cabin and thought it would be funny to scare whoever was inside. I tried to convince myself of that. But that night, everything changed. I had barely turned off the lantern when I heard something outside. Not just footsteps this time. Breathing. Slow, heavy breathing, just on the other side of the wall. I felt paralyzed. The breathing moved to the window, and though I couldn't see anything in the darkness, I felt the undeniable presence of someone staring in, watching me. I knew then that I had made a mistake. This wasn't just a hiker. This wasn't just an animal. Someone had been waiting, watching, and now they were getting bolder. I didn't sleep at all that night. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I grabbed my bag, threw everything I could into it, and ran to my car. The moment I got inside, I locked the doors and started the engine. As I pulled away, I forced myself to look back at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of the trees, partially hidden in the shadows. Tall, unmoving, watching me leave. I never went back. I don't know who or what I encountered out there, but I know one thing for sure. I was never alone in that cabin. Not for a single moment.